Hello and welcome to Moderate Fantasy Violence, a podcast about pop culture and the world around it. I'm Nick Byrne.
And I'm Alastair Ball.
And in this amazing 9th episode, we'll be looking at the DC Rebirth relaunch, which, considering Alastair is an experienced comic reader, and this is definitely aimed at them, is going to be interesting. And then we'll be covering the Warcraft movie, adapting the massively popular, massively multiplayer video game, the BBC relaunch of Top Gear, and then we'll be seeing what Alastair thought of Black Panther by Christopher Priest and Mark Texeira, which is one of my favourite comics ever, so no pressure, but if you don't like it, then this is the last episode. So, before we get into that high-pressure situation, have you seen, watched or done anything else this fortnight, Alastair?
Well, I've been watching iZombie, which I believe, you mentioned in a previous episode.
I did. I'm glad someone's listening to these recommendations.
Yeah, it's a really good show. It's from the creator of Veronica Mars, which is a show I've really, really enjoyed. It's got that same kind of, I guess, upbeat peppiness, but this one has a darker tinge to it. For those who aren't familiar with the show, it's about a young woman. She's training to be a surgeon. She's very, very bright, but perhaps, I don't know, a bit more focused on her career than her friends and family. She then goes to a party, is bitten by a zombie, becomes a zombie, now has to work in a morgue and solves crimes by eating bits of people's brains and then getting important information about the case for that. It's quite an unusual premise, but it's very entertaining.
It's odd. I mean, there's a lot of these shows where they take an interesting premise and then weld a procedural crime element onto it. But iZombie, I think, works a lot better than most of them.
Yeah, it's like anything. Take unusual setup and then add, and she solves crimes.
Yeah, it's also based on a comic, of course, like all the good things.
Yeah, it's a great show. I'd recommend anyone who, especially if you like Veronica Mars, or if you like zombies, or if you like, I don't know, procedural crime TV shows, but with an odd twist.
Yeah, if you like quirky procedural crime, this is definitely one of the better ones.
Yeah. So, Nick, what have you been watching this week?
Well, after I saw the controversy erupting over the recent Captain America issue. Oh, by the way, spoilers. Just generally spoilers, I think. This is going to be an episode where we spoil what we're talking about.
There'll be a lot of spoilers.
Yes. So, starting right away with some spoilers. Last chance to leave. Remember, I do put the timestamps in the episode notes, so if you want to skip a specific segment to avoid me spoiling exactly what car they're driving in Top Gear or something like that, you can do that. Anyway, in the most recent issue of the Steve Rogers Captain America series, it was revealed that he was, well, he turns to the camera at the end, does something evil and says, "Hail Hydra." So the implication is that he's some sort of Hydra sleeper, and there's the further implication, based on a vague flashback, is that he's been a Hydra sleeper for a long time, possibly for his entire career. Now, I haven't read the issue. All of what I just said, I got off online recaps. I don't really buy new Marvel comics at the moment because they cost a lot of money. So I subscribe to Marvel Unlimited and read them 6 months later. So what I did to try and engage with this controversy is I went on Marvel Unlimited and I read the first 3 issues of Captain America Sam Wilson, the other Captain America series featuring the former Falcon as Captain America, which is written by the same guy, Nick Spencer, and drawn by Daniel Acuna, and I read the first 3 issues of that, and I was reassured, actually. They're really good. I mean, yeah, they're really solid superhero stuff. He's clearly a writer who wants to engage in the politics of the day. There's a bit of Sam Wilson trying to inject his personal liberal values into his Captain America-ing, and somewhat getting a bit of blowback from that. And yeah, it's interesting, it's very engaged, it's got a bit of nuance. I really liked it. Clearly, this is a writer who wants to deal with this sort of thing, and I guess when you deal with this sort of thing, there's a risk you're going to offend people. But reading those issues did at least give me a sense that he's doing it in an intelligent, nuanced way, and there's probably some nuance to come after what we already know. And they were also quite pleasingly uncynical, because I think one of the ways they have slightly mishandled the Hydra thing is given interviews where there's a certain tone of, he's evil, that's it, this is it now, forever. And yeah, there's a cynicism to it, or at least it comes across as a cynical twist, which is perhaps a difficult tone to take when you're dealing with something that some people will find upsetting.
Do you think there are any grounds do the people have who are offended to being offended? Do you think people are reacting too early?
I don't know. I'm reluctant. I'm not going to tell people they can't be offended. There are people who have closer ties to this, who are more invested in the character of Steve Rogers, or are more invested in the impact of the Holocaust, say. But I'm not going to tell them they can't be offended by this if this is something that's massively triggering for them. I think there's scope for the writer's going somewhere with this, and I'm happy to give him the space. But if it's something that massively upsets you, I'm not going to tell you can't be upset. I also, yeah, as I say, it was quite uncynical, the actual writing in the Sam Wilson issue. Sam Wilson does come across as a genuinely nice, good-hearted person. It sounds like the story wants us to like him and doesn't want to make fun of him for being naive or anything like that. So, yeah, I think there's enough there for me to say I'm curious where it goes. It could still go somewhere massively offensive, but I suspect, as of now, that there's probably more nuance coming in the subsequent issues. And obviously I'll find out in like 6 or 7 or 8 months' time when the subsequent issues go up on Marvel Unlimited, or when, let's face it, they're spoilt for me on the internet. And from one recent controversial comic, I guess we're now going into another. Okay, so first up, it's DC Rebirth. We actually talked about this back in episode 2 in terms of some context about exactly what it is and why it's being done, and how it's sort of a reaction to the perceived failure of the New 52 relaunch a few years back. So if you want some context about the relaunch as a whole, I'd probably still recommend going back and listening to our second episode, but since we've already done that, I think we're going to try and go straight into talking about the actual comics now. So we have read the DC Rebirth special, which is meant as this sort of one-off anchoring issue for the entire relaunch, and that's by writer Jeff Johns, who's written a lot of high-profile DC comics in his time, and it's drawn by Gary Frank, Ethan Van Sciver, Ivan Rice, and Phil Jimenez. And then that was a large 80-page issue, and we also covered, just to get a taste of the day-to-day life in Rebirth, Batman Rebirth by Tom King, Scott Snyder, and Mikhail Janin. So I think just taking them one at a time. Obviously, Alastair not read many mainstream superhero comics in recent days, and this relaunch, as we said in episode 2, is, I think, primarily aimed at bringing back lapsed readers who might have drifted off during the New 52. So, as somebody who doesn't fit into that demographic at all, Alastair, how did you find it?
I think ultimately I did find it difficult to follow, being not a regular comics reader or a regular DC reader. I mainly got the sense that it was more the fact that I wasn't a regular DC reader, not that I don't read comics regularly. It wasn't to do with the nature of the medium that I found the stories somewhat difficult to follow. It was more because I wasn't so familiar with the characters or their previous stories.
Yeah, it was very much throwing you in with, look, here's that guy who you haven't seen for a while because we didn't use them in the New 52, which will obviously give you a warm, cuddly feeling on the condition that you know who that guy is.
Yeah, and it takes a while in DC Rebirth. It takes a while for they introduce their kind of narrator, and I assumed there was people would know from quite early on who he is, and I found it, even after it was revealed who it was, quite confusing.
Wally West.
Wally West, yeah.
Or Willie Watts, as you said brilliantly in the pub the other night.
Yeah, Willie What's-his-face.
Yeah.
What I would have expected if DC were planning to relaunch their entire comics line, which is obviously very timely because they're just launching their major new film franchise. You know, we covered Batman vs. Superman, Dawn of Justice, there's Justice League films, Wonder Woman films, Aquaman films coming soon. So it makes sense that they would tie in new comics with these films to make it accessible to new readers. The thing is, this fundamentally isn't very accessible to new readers because it's got so many established characters, even like established plot lines. I mean, there was references to things that I've heard about people talking on Twitter who read comics. Batman mentions the chair, which I believe was something in a previous plot line. Superman appears to be, spoiler warning for just general DC comic related stuff from this point in, but Superman appears to be dead.
Yeah, basically, yeah, that's one of their big sort of take-backsies for the New 52. The New 52 version of Superman has died, and the old one has just come back. The bloke, there's a bit where that bloke in a beard,
yeah,
who looks a lot like Superman because he is Superman, is talking to a mysterious hooded figure. And I can't remember if they actually gave enough context for you to realise that the bearded man was Superman, but that was the old pre-New 52 Superman who is now taking the job back, basically.
All right, see, I didn't get any of that. Because I just, I didn't know where Superman was in this plot. I mean, I got the obvious stuff when there was a lot of reporters and news coverage saying, Superman has disappeared, Superman may have died, the FBI is investigating his death, or at least his disappearance. So I got that, but I didn't get this. I didn't. No, that flew straight over my head in a manner of Superman.
So to try and, I don't know, specify it a bit, would you say you followed the broad narrative with Wally West appearing and trying to get back to reality?
Yes, I followed that story, and actually I did really like it when I got into it. And after they sort of filled in a bit of who he was, and I liked that fact that they managed to create. Obviously, they've got a lot of characters, way more than just Batman, Superman, Wonder Woman. There's a huge range of characters, and I really liked how they did create what is a relatively short story that did weave all the characters together using this quite clever narrative construct of there's Wally West. He's trapped in what's called the Speed Force, some kind of alternative dimension. He's trying to break through into our reality and basically contacts various friends of his, famous DC characters. So that way they get to bring in a little bit of each character, which I thought worked really well.
And yeah, I'm not a huge Flash comics person. I like the TV show, and during the brief periods where I've read DC comics, there was a Justice League run by the writer Grant Morrison and the artist Howard Porter in the 90s, which I liked, and during that period Wally West was the Flash. So I have read some Wally West, and yeah, I thought on a sort of storytelling level, the bit where his sort of journey and was quite good and even quite emotional at the end. I felt a genuine pang of oh dear, that's sad, but it looks for a few seconds like he might actually die before Barry Allen pulled him out.
Yeah, I felt the same. Yeah, I thought it was, and he sees like a younger version of himself. He sees his cousin as well, and he has this sort of brilliant moment of realization that, life, he's dying, he's lost in the Speed Force, but, life does go on. People will continue the work that he's been doing, and it is a really, a great warm emotional moment. It did really work.
Honestly, I don't know if I'd been advised to give it the brief of write a story that does this, probably quite long bullet point list. I honestly don't know if it could have been done better. Jeff Johns, as I said, has done a lot of big DC event comics juggling 12 million characters. I think he is pretty good at it, at making it seem at least vaguely human.
I think you're right that I don't see a way how this could have been really done better. I mean, if it was me, and I had complete creative freedom, I'd have just cleared the deck and started with just the core characters that you kind of have an understanding of through what I call cultural osmosis. You don't have to have read any comics or even seen any films to know who Batman is, to know who Superman is. So if I wanted to create a story that's accessible to people who aren't DC fans, start with these characters that we have, that everyone just kind of gets an understanding of from general pop culture. I mean, because there were characters in there that I didn't know particularly well at all. Like, I don't really know the Atom. I don't really know Aquaman. There were some characters I didn't even understand at all who they were. But that doesn't mean to say they didn't have a little, a small chunk of story that I could follow and get something from. But it does come back to this point that it is a bit inaccessible if you're not a regular DC reader.
I don't know, it's a shame in a way, because this was a big opportunity and it was quite well promoted and it was a fairly cheap, by modern comic standards, £2 for 80 pages. And yeah, I don't know, it's perfectly well written for what it is, which is broadly a sort of a bit of a cry out to long-term fans saying, we've changed, come back. The characters you love are still there and still roughly the same.
Yeah.
Which, I don't know, it's one of these things we think they could have done a bit more with it.
Yeah, I can see why they've got to balance this thing, the two things of attracting new readers and also getting back readers they may have lost. It's difficult to achieve so many things with one story, and for something that was very ambitious, I think it certainly could have come across a lot worse. What it reminded me of the most, it kind of felt like the first episode in a new series of Game of Thrones, in that you got lots of characters, in each one for pretty much one scene or a brief segment. A few characters like Batman get a couple of segments. And you don't really get, a story progression for each character. You kind of get, this is their character in this situation. And then you assume that in the future, they're going to move these characters forward. So it didn't feel like, other than Wally West, who had a complete story, each other character didn't feel like they had much of a story. It was more like they were just lining up characters on starting blocks, and then stories would follow. Yeah,
which would have worked better if this was like the first issue of a ongoing DC Rebirth series, or I don't know, Game of DC or something.
Yeah,
but of course it's like a one-off, and all this isn't a teaser for like one ongoing mega story. It's a teaser for like about 60 ongoing comics, which does make it feel a bit more like a series of trailers than a coherent thing.
Yeah, the other issue with that is that when I got to the end, and especially the final few pages, really got very good, and I was actually quite intrigued, and I was like, I want to find out where the story goes. And then I suddenly realized I don't even really know how I continue to follow this story, because there isn't like a DC Rebirth 2 that I can read that picks up this story. I mean, as someone who's not a comics fan, I'm confused about what I have to read next to continue finding out this story.
Yeah, I mean, Wally West is, I think, off to join the Titans or something, but I don't know if that's actually going to continue this sort of story they're hinting at about the mysterious baddie who's been interfering with the DC universe.
Yeah, because the other plot line is that some cosmic power, is it Dr. Manhattan from the Watchmen
comics? Yes, okay, well, Jeff Johns managed to get that across.
And that's because I've seen the Watchmen film. It was given away because, and again, this is massive spoilers, but it was given away being in the final few panels. Batman finds the comedian's blood-stained smiley face logo.
Yeah.
So when that turned up, I recognised that as, oh, that's the comedian. And then the pieces fell into place. That they've been hinting at this kind of enormous, powerful cosmic being, possibly a sort of a temporal being or an extra-temporal being, and there's a being that's outside time or has some ability to control time, has been interfering with the DC universe. You said that's their handy way of erasing the previous few years of comics.
I don't think they're erasing the New 52 so much as just sort of implying that it's been a sort of contained interference, and the universe from before is now going to continue sort of alongside it.
And they explicitly say it's not a villain they've encountered before, which actually, and as a new reader, I really liked that, because it made me think, oh great, it won't be some obscure character that I've never heard of. This means that great, it will be something new, so it'll be accessible to a new reader. And then in the final panel, or one of the final panels, Batman finds the comedian's logo from the Watchmen comics, and then it suddenly fell into place like, oh yeah, in that comics there is a very, very powerful extratemporal godlike being, so therefore there must be at least have something to do with it.
It's weird. There's a lot of sort of meta commentary alongside that. I mean, a lot of the bits of the narration are talking about how I think one of Wally West's first lines in like page 2 or something is something like, "I love this world, but there's something missing," or "There's something not quite right," or "Things just got so dark." I mean, partly it's building up to Dr. Manhattan as some sort of baddie, but also, again, there's a sort of a meta, we're talking straight to the readers thing here.
Yeah, there's also an element because like, people can't remember who he is. Like, he tries to meet his old girlfriend or love interest, and she doesn't remember who he is. Batman doesn't remember who he is.
Oh, that's part of the general message of, "We're very sorry about the New 52, please come back." It's also, I don't know, you could read it as a commentary on superhero comics in the last, God, how long has it been? 30 years, I guess.
Their ability to write stories and then erase them. And
no, less that. The idea that, I mean, a lot of people have written better critical essays than I'm about to deliver about the way that the arrival of dark deconstructionist superhero comics, primarily Watchmen, in the 80s, has been something that other comic writers have been trying with varying degrees of success to replicate ever since, and has resulted in quite a lot of grim superhero comics where teen sidekicks have their arms ripped off or whatever.
That's partly because we've moved, in the 80s, we moved from the age of modernism to the age of postmodernism, when commentary, self-awareness, irony, all those things were considered valuable properties in art. So, and that's reflected in comics, where you get comics like Watchmen that look at the codes and conventions of comics as a medium and play around with those, because it's very much a feature of postmodernism, which was kind of at its height in the 80s and 90s.
I think it's overly simplistic to say imitating Watchmen made comics darker, therefore Watchmen is shit. Watchmen is not shit, but the various pale imitations of it arguably are.
Yeah, but I think it's interesting that they're going to fold Watchmen into the DC universe. Again, partly because as not a regular reader, Watchmen is something I'm familiar with, generally through cultural osmosis, or more specifically, geek culture osmosis, which is if you're into general geek culture, you will find out about Watchmen. Watchmen may not have broke into the mainstream culture. I guess it had a film that was, briefly here and not particularly good, if I'm going to be honest. But as a geek, you become aware of Watchmen. Even though I've not read the comic, I have seen the film. It is just something you are just aware of anyway, and I was aware of it before the film came out. Because of this high-level awareness, they can do simple things like put in the comedian's logo of the smiley face with the bloodstain on it, and it's instantly recognisable, and that works really well.
Yeah, again, it's a good bit of writing by Jeff Johns. The panel-by-panel writing in this comic is, it's really good. It's weird. There are parts where it's a bit overwritten, to be honest. I think there are pages that could do with a bit less Wally West narration, to be honest. And there are parts where it's actually really economical and good, like that bit with Batman at the end.
Yeah, exactly. And it's useful to have a character like Wally West to tie it all together, and it's great that it tells a self-contained story of his return from the Speed Force to our reality, or to the reality he came from. And that was a great little self-contained story. It really worked, as a thing in its own right. My other criticism is that it looks like the New 52 or a decade of these characters' lives has been removed. As a new reader, I'd interpret that as partly them saying it's okay if you don't know about the past because it's been removed. But what I got from the story was a sense that the past was very important. It referenced lots of things that I was quite confused about, like the death of the Flash.
Well, I think the past is important. We're bringing it back. It's a bit of a moral here, yeah.
Yeah, which is something, again, I guess it's just difficult to pick up on as a new reader.
Yeah.
But I certainly was really intrigued, especially at the end. I mean, I really liked it as a self-contained story. And when I was getting to the end, I did feel like, okay, that's interesting. But, that was an interesting little story. But, I'm not particularly inspired to read more. Then, right at the end, that was a great twist.
Yeah, it's another controversial twist. We came out the same day as that Steve Rogers comic. So, yeah, controversy all over the place. Because Alan Moore has always been very explicit about how he feels DC screwed him over to keep the rights to Watchmen. And he's not a big fan of the subsequent exploitation of those characters. So I can't imagine having them folded into the DC universe is really pleasing Alan Moore in any way.
But in a certain sense, the Watchmen characters have to exist in a different universe because their story is so big, it contains its entire universe in itself. I mean, I don't see this...
That's his point, I think. I think he likes the fact that Watchmen is a self-contained 12-issue unit, and it isn't tied to anything else.
Because there's clearly no Batman, no Superman...
Yeah. No, I mean, there are some characters who are clearly sort of vaguely analogous to classic superheroes, but yeah.
The Owl is reminding me of Batman a bit.
This isn't the first time that's happened. The seal has kind of been broken on revisiting Watchmen for money, partly by the movie, which Alan Moore disapproved of, and partly by the series of prequel comics called Before Watchmen. There was about 20 of them that DC did a couple of years back, which, surprisingly enough, Alan Moore disapproved of. There are people who do feel that Alan Moore got screwed, that DC is basically taking an attitude, well, we've already screwed him, we may as well just turn the screw a bit further, which they feel is a bit...
Well, I guess they've got this valuable property, and also it is something that people have an awareness of So it is something they can use to attract new readers, or at least people from wider geek culture, like people like me who are interested in geek culture but don't necessarily read comics. By connecting the DC characters to something that I'm already familiar with, it makes me more interested to read more, especially if, like, it's what I really didn't like about the end of Batman vs. Superman. Again, spoilers, but at the end of Batman vs. Superman, they put Lex Luthor in a cage and he basically shouts at them about some other massive DC Universe villain that I have no knowledge of, which I just felt confusing and alienating. Whereas this ended in a much better way by throwing a hint to something that there was at least a good chance a lot of the readers would be familiar with. That worked much better.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of, is it a good twist? Is it an interesting new way to bang our action figures together? Yeah, it's a good twist. It's just, yeah, from a creative rights perspective, I think it's seen as a bit, are we still...
Should we talk about Batman specifically?
We shall. I mean, I don't have a vast amount to say about Batman Rebirth. I expected to like this a bit more than DC Rebirth, because partly I like Batman and partly it's by Tom King, who is very much a hot new talent of current comics. But to be honest, I was a bit sort of, yeah, that was a pleasant, well-executed, but kind of forgettable Batman story.
Yeah, again, I like the fact that it started sort of in the middle of the story.
It did throw you in and just expect you to catch up and let you just enjoy it. It didn't do the 17,000th recap of his parents dying, which you've got to appreciate.
Certainly, yeah. And, you know, even this kind of small sort of contained story started when the drama was already underway. You know, they went straight into the conflict. And, you know, going straight into the conflict, you know, meant that, you know, there was a real sense of momentum behind the story.
Not devoid of cool ideas. I thought the new kid, who's his sort of sidekick, but not Robin, is a touch that could unfold in interesting ways. I liked they've done a slight revamp on this old villain, the Calendar Man. His body is reborn. I see what they've done there. Every year it's actually a new addition to that character, and it was quite interesting. And the bit where his body comes out of his mouth was a nice bit of sort of body horror.
Yeah, that was quite grotesque.
Really nicely drawn by Mikhail Janin. And yeah, the art was all lovely, actually. Yeah, it was very clear, very Batman. And yeah, I enjoyed some of the occasional slightly sillier moments, like, oh look, it's Bruce Wayne doing pull-ups on the side of the helipad. I mean, on the one hand that's stupid, but on the other hand it's kind of funny in a comics guy way.
It was just, yeah, it's quite over the top.
But yeah, it was fine. I don't know, I feel like, I don't know if DC have done some sort of edict that all the Rebirth issues have to be sort of incredibly contained one-offs, and then the actual story in a sort of ongoing comic way will start in issue 1. But I felt like this issue may have, if anything, been a bit constrained by that.
I felt it slightly confusing that in DC Rebirth itself, Batman is investigating the Joker, and there's this strange thing of how Batman has discovered that there's actually 3 different Jokers, or possibly. And it seems to also be continuing from the previous Batman story, because again, he references the chair, which is something I'm aware of because of people tweeting about it. But now in the actual Batman comic itself, the villain is the Calendar Man, and the Joker doesn't seem to be a factor at all.
It is odd, yeah, but putting this as the first major Batman comic after Rebirth, and there are, like, yeah, as you say, 2 major Batman developments in Rebirth, the Joker and the discovery of the comedian's button, and neither of those are mentioned at all, and he doesn't seem at all concerned. To an extent, you just have to throw your hands up and go, comics, it's just one of those things. But obviously, the reason for that is that I think a lot of that's going to be dealt with in other Jeff Johns comics or down the line or something, but it does come across as a bit weird.
But yeah, it was somewhat inconsistent.
Yeah, but the art was nice. In fact, since I didn't mention it, I know that's quite bad comic reviewing form. The art in DC Rebirth was also nice. It was, obviously, for their big relaunch issue, it was very straightforward, iconic, big, clear. I don't know, considering their big message was, we're undarkening. It was still quite sort of dark, muted tone superhero art for most of the time. If they want to really push this message, I would consider bringing in something a bit fluffier. I
thought the way they did the Speed Force was very good. It's really hard to illustrate something that is, you know, the notion of time or pure energy or being outside time. I mean, we're humans, we visualize things, you know, we imagine things visually, and this is something, you know, outside reality, quantum reality is something that just like inherently kind of messes with our brains. It's almost impossible to imagine or to visualize. So, and I think they did quite a good job of, I guess, you know, finding a way to visualize the unimaginable, or, you know, it was an interesting way of going about that.
Well, yeah, but a lot of that was effects and stuff. That might well have been more the colorist than the artist. But yeah, a lot of the way he fell through panels and stuff, and his final moment with Barry when he was sort of dissolving away, it was all quite nice.
Yeah, it was good. Yeah, in a story that's quite complicated and has a lot of characters in it, the art was really well choreographed so that you could move clearly from plot line to plot line, and you knew exactly where you were. You knew when a new plot line had begun. You knew kind of what characters you were with. It really really kept the story grounded and made it more accessible. And what could have been a really complicated, confusing story, it kind of gave it the kind of the superstructure that made it accessible and made it work.
Yeah, but I think that comes in with alongside our general message about the DC Rebirth special, doesn't it? It's like, yeah, good storytelling, good comic, really well made. Just maybe not quite what we personally wanted from it.
It's a missed opportunity to reach out to people who are DC agnostic. Next up, we will be discussing Duncan Jones's high fantasy epic Warcraft: The Beginning, based on the hugely successful MMORPG video game World of Warcraft. This film tells the story of the origin of the conflict between humans and orcs, when orcs first invaded the world of humans. The twist with this film is that the story is told from both human and orc point of view. It's an unusual take on a familiar fantasy story. Nick, what did you think of the film?
I think it was trying to do some interesting things, but I'm unfortunately not sure it succeeded in many of them. Yeah, there was a lot of characters, which all filled quite bland fantasy tropes, delivering quite functional dialogue. It did look really impressive a lot of the time. Some of the battles were pretty good and pretty epic. The orcs, yeah, I mean, considering that the orcs were given almost sort of equal point of view value, yeah, they were really impressive creations. They did look like they were alive. I didn't sit there going, that orc looks shit for the entire film, which would have been a depressing state to be in. The orcs, especially the 3-4 orcs who had like proper speaking roles, did look like they were actually things that were alive. I wasn't thrown out of the film by it. So yeah, that is really impressive. We've reached that stage where you can have this entire CGI created community and they seem like viable characters. In fact, to be honest, the main sympathetic orc, Duratan, was probably the most fully realised, relatable character, to be honest. He was one of the only ones who actually occasionally had sort of non-functional fun dialogue.
Yeah, the orcs had a lot more personality than the humans, who in this film were just generically brave and strong.
Yeah, it was weird because, I mean, obviously, yeah, as you say, one of the big selling points of this film is we're totally going to give the orcs a fair hearing, but it seems like they've then become so focused on trying to make sure they give the orcs a fair hearing, but the humans come across as a bit dull.
Yeah, that's certainly it. I mean, what I felt the main flaw of this film is it does fall into a lot of the cliches of high fantasy. It takes place in this whole world, and they have, created a whole sort of, world for this film. It's obviously a lot of it drawn from the World of Warcraft computer game. But they have created this whole world, and it is very rich, but it just seems completely disconnected from our world. I mean, it doesn't seem to have any of the kind of, the politics or the struggles of our world. And that's the problem which high fantasy or fantasy stories in general can fall into, when the world becomes so very fantastical that it really becomes quite difficult to relate to.
Yeah, it was a problem, especially with, as you say, with the human side. The orc side, there will seem to be at least a vague desire to show that these are, people. They have a society. There's a structure. There's conflicts within that structure. They have families.
Yeah, they're not just monsters that just exist to attack and kill things, which they do in Lord of the Rings. They're just basically machines for killing.
Yeah, and then the problem with that is the humans do massively suffer in comparison. They are just archetypes. They do just stand there and go, I am the king. In fairness to the king, actually, Dominic Cooper's probably one of the best, comes across one of the best out of the humans.
I think he did the most with what is quite a thin part, but it's just there's no depth or anything to things. Like the king is just, he's a man in his mid-30s, he's strong and wise. I mean, there's no way to make him more interesting. Like maybe he could be a really old king who's, kind of losing grasp, and that's why his kingdom's under threat. Or maybe he could be a really young king who, he's just come to the throne and he's uncertain of his political powers or how things are done. Or maybe he could be a king that's too aggressive or a king that's not aggressive enough. But there's no depth or complexity to his character. He's just a king. He's clever and he's strong and he's the king. And that's basically it.
The apprentice, the young up-and-coming mystic.
Yeah.
He's all right. So I suppose he's possibly taking back slightly what I just said about Dominic Cooper. He probably has the most personality out of any of the humans, in that he clearly suffers from uncertainty. There's a few bits which with him that are actually sort of played for a joke.
Yeah, he trained to be a mage, and then he ran away from the city of the mages during his training because it wasn't for him, and now he's a drifter and sort of a bit of an outcast. And yeah, and he's got sort of, he's got a bit more substance to his characters, but but then also they have the ridiculous cliche of he meets this other mage who's just generically wizardy, generically powerful. He can basically hold his hands in the air, wave them, say some words, and then do anything he wants.
Yeah, he was all right. His general wizard master, yeah, the twist with him was not that surprising. he wasn't that interesting. Something had to happen. And then the ending, again, obviously, maximum spoilers, the ending did kind of undo a bit of the work. I mean, the bit where they killed off the one sympathetic orc shortly before the final confrontation. On the one hand, congratulations on surprising me. That was one of the few times in that film where I genuinely sort of sat slightly up in my chair. I was like, oh, well, shit, I didn't expect him to do that. I'm actually sad, because that character was one of the few good developed ones. But yeah, the death of the one sympathetic orc, well, there was his one half sympathetic friend, but still, did mean that we then finished the film with the orcs as kind of just a vague horde fighting the not that well drawn humans.
They managed to kill most of their main characters before the end of the film, which did mean that like the actual climax and denouement of the film felt rather empty because it didn't really have any of the main characters in it.
Yeah, the darkly funny part is that, yeah, they killed off loads of the main characters, and yet they didn't manage to kill off the not even that interesting villain. The one thing I wanted from this film was for the evil magic orc to still be alive. I mean, the evil magic orc wasn't bad as a villain in his way. He had his sort of strikingly evil-looking visual. He did his thing of keeping prisoners around so he could suck their life forces out, which was kind of...
It was quite creepy.
Creepily horrific in a sort of a nice casual way. The way he would just sort of always, rather than there being scenes where he just went up to the prisoners and sucked their life force out while screaming a lot. He was just sort of casually doing it mid-conversation whilst talking to other characters about other things. And that was, I thought, quite a nice touch. But he wasn't such an amazing, sensational villain, but I felt that leaving him alive for the sequel was worth the lack of catharsis that resulted.
Yeah.
His vague sidekick being disemboweled didn't really make up for that.
For a film that kind of, I know, kills off most of its main characters and has quite a lot of things happening in it, it didn't really resolve much plot at the end. I mean, the villains were still the villains, and the central conflict hadn't really been resolved. I guess this film is called Warcraft: The Beginning. From that, we're supposed to interpret that there will be sequels.
Warcraft: The Beginning. Yeah, I mean, to be honest, the tacking on of the beginning title, which must have happened late-ish in the day, because it definitely wasn't on the first few trailers, and it isn't even on the title of the film when it comes up on screen. And it does just seem a bit... I mean, I don't know, is that meant to just be preparing us for the fact that the film has a really vague ending? Or at least an ending that comes across as that was the pilot episode, we're just setting up the conflict.
It's too much throw to sequel.
It's too much throw to sequel, and it's just it just expects you to be more... I mean, maybe it's just because I'm not a big fan of either World of Warcraft or, if we're being really honest, high fantasy. So a film that's really general high fantasy without making any effort to twist it or play with it or elevate it through beautiful execution.
Or do something interesting with it.
Or if you want to be really harsh, yeah, that. It's not going to do that much for me. So you could argue I'm just not the target audience, and there's probably some validity in that. I didn't think this really did enough to play with its cliches, aside from throwing in a few sympathetic orcs who helpfully died before the finale, thus meaning the final battle was still just evil orcs versus good humans.
I think you hit it kind of in the head there, which is it is very much a high fantasy story that doesn't kind of, make any allowances for people who aren't particularly interested in high fantasy. I mean, as someone who's been a writer of sort of science fiction and fantasy for a few years and been involved in writers' groups, it really did, and this is probably the most damning criticism of it, a lot of it reminded me of some of the bad generic fantasy I heard people reading out at my university writers' group. It was all the tropes of the genre, wizards flying on griffins, cities in the sky, giant magical towers, portals, orcs, elves, people with glowing eyes, but nothing that kind of, no character substance, no, conflict substance, little plot, nothing to ground in reality other than just like a big fantasy wank-off. To contrast this with Game of Thrones, which is, I guess, the obvious comparison, but everyone says, and which is what makes Game of Thrones great, everyone says, I'm not into fantasy, but I love this show. And the reason for that is that the fantasy elements of Game of Thrones are minimized and put in more of a greater context, such as, the dragons and the White Walkers and the zombies and the mystic stuff is kind of secondary to human conflict from relatable and interesting characters and believable political conflict, which is kind of relatable as a sort of medieval power struggle. The fact that one of the kind of external threatening forces, say like the Ottoman Empire was during the late Middle Ages, has dragons is rather by the by. It's recognisable as a conflict from our world, which makes it relatable, which means people can be invested in it.
Yeah, I mean, the thing that everyone sort of focused on when they were writing sort of trying to be optimistic pieces about this film was the fact it was directed by Duncan Jones, which I think did give people some hope that he would elevate the material and do something interesting with it. And with the exception of a few sort of visual directorial flourishes, I don't feel like there's much, and the fact that it does visually look good, I don't feel like he's really elevated the material.
I get the feeling his hands were probably quite tied by this and he wanted to do more. I could see just little moments of humour or, flair. Duncan Jones really desperately trying to give this film some personality, just something. It's like the little bits like when they first go to the mage and the mage's tower, and they're this sort of the powerful mage, and the main character has to walk up like hundreds of flights of stairs to meet the mage, and he's just kind of gasping for air and exhausted and a bit kind of like, oh god, why did I sign up to this? And he looks up and sees like there's still huge numbers of steps to go. There's kind of a little bit kind of like, oh yeah, it's really inconvenient living in a massive tower. That's really annoying. And that's kind of funny, but they give me these moments of like he was only given these kind of little bit around the edges to kind of exhume some personality out of this quite dry film.
I don't know, I feel like characterising Duncan Jones as a prisoner of Warcraft is, I don't know. I feel like he would surely, if it was genuinely that much of a straitjacket, he would surely have walked away. I mean, some reviews have pointed out that he has talked extensively about being a massive, massive fan of the World of Warcraft universe. So maybe there's some degree of losing sight, but other people won't be as automatically invested in this material as he is. I don't know.
That is a strong possibility.
I mean, if he was working on this as like a prisoner down the mines, that's a shame, because obviously based on Moon, which I've seen, and I gather Source Code was good as well, if I haven't seen it.
Yeah, they're both really good films.
He's one of the promising young sci-fi fantasy filmmakers of our time. He could have been doing something more interesting. So yeah, I don't know whether this is an example of him perhaps getting a bit too far down the fandom rabbit hole and losing track of the fact that this wasn't very accessible, or if he was just straitjacketed, toiling away, knowing that he could only pick around the sides. But either way, it kind of hasn't emerged that well.
It seems strange that there's a director who's, both Moon and Source Code are very character driven. Even though they both have a lot of environmental conflict in both of them, both have a really strong character at their core, which is what makes the film, and a really strong performance from the actor, which is completely lacking from Warcraft. It's got too many characters, they lack personality. Some of the human characters, I couldn't even tell them apart at different points.
Yeah, I don't know. I haven't seen Source Code, as I said. Moon, one of the things that made that work kind of was that it all felt very real, even though I'm assuming there must have been a fair amount of effects involved. But I got the feeling a lot of it was practical effects rather than it being 100% CGI.
But I mean, it's hard to get anyone to work with special effects to this degree. I mean, like that's one of the criticisms that's levied at the Star Wars prequel trilogy, in that George Lucas was very good working with practical effects, working with models, and actors and stuff, and then he just kind of swept that all away for kind of weightless CGI in the prequel trilogy. And
yeah, as I said earlier, the effects in this are actually quite good. As fantasy effects go, the orcs don't look distractingly fake.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'm guessing it must be hard to really bring a core humanity out of it sometimes.
And they've got real personality. And yeah, in fact, even the main orc is probably the most interesting character in the film.
And then he dies, and then after that it's a bit...
I know, and also there's he's got much more personality than these human characters who, as I said, in some ways are pretty interchangeable. Their personal conflicts just get kind of completely sort of swept aside by the kind of, this sort of thundering parade of special effects. And there's even a moment when I think one of the main characters, their son, is killed in a battle, and there's just no emotion there. It's just like hollow. Yeah,
it has to be said, of all the human characters, the guy playing the main warrior really did do the least for me. He was just a bit...
Yeah. He's one of the few who gets to survive.
As a generic battle-hardened warrior, he was incredibly generic, and he ends up as king at the end, doesn't he? The idea that they've killed off Dominic Cooper, who does at least have charisma, and replaced him with this other guy didn't really sell me on the sequel, to be honest.
No.
Although for fans of Preacher, which we covered last episode, seeing Dominic Cooper and Ruth Negga playing a couple again must have had, some fanboy points for you.
Next up, we will be discussing the new series of Top Gear. Jeremy Clarkson left the BBC's flagship general car-themed entertainment show under less than auspicious circumstances, shall we say. He was followed by his co-stars also resigning. So the BBC have decided to revamp the show with a new lineup and new presenters. That includes Chris Evans and also Matt LeBlanc, aka Joey from Friends. It's a lineup that certainly caught my attention, certainly some unusual choices. But Nick, what did you think?
I thought it was all right. I thought there were parts of it that didn't work. I feel kind of bad complaining about it because it's obviously gotten a bit of a savaging from the British press in a, sometimes, to be honest, slightly mean-spirited and unpleasant get the BBC way. But yeah, it's sort of an odd mix of interesting new stuff, which I sort of quite like, and occasions where they seem to be really trying to do a sort of cover version of the old one.
They kept the Top Gear blueprint quite similar. Top Gear is known for its silly challenges involving driving cars up ridiculous terrain or doing ridiculous races or time challenges. So they managed to keep that.
I think they've changed the intro visuals, but it's the same theme, the same setup, the same set, the same, some say, joke whenever the Stig appears. I mean, I stopped watching Top Gear, the Clarkson-Hammond-May version, a couple of years back because, although they did have good chemistry, the format was just getting a bit samey for me, so...
It does become quite formulaic. I mean, I'm not particularly interested in cars, so the bits when they're just driving kind of supercars at like insane speeds on a runway aren't so interesting. I do like it when they come up with interesting challenges, like, for example, can Jeremy Clarkson drive up a cliff faster than someone can climb it? Or one of my favourites was, you've seen how many caravans a motorcycle can jump over, but how many motorcycles can a caravan jump over?
Yeah, it's that sort of off-the-wall stuff. I mean, there were bits of that. In terms of challenge films, I thought the one in the second episode, the South Africa one, was a bit better.
Yeah, that was better, partly because it was some beautiful footage, and also it was, it had some good moments.
The bit where they roped in Eddie Jordan was a bit weird, but the celebrity guests, although, you hear Top Gear drive around South Africa with celebrity guests, you at first think, oh, this is going to be really gimmicky, but yeah, to be honest, if they're not like wed to this, it's about the three guys format, which they're not really anymore now that they've ditched it. They might as well mess around with it a bit, to be honest. I thought the three guests did actually add something.
They've introduced a new dynamic in this, which having the first American presenter in Matt LeBlanc, now they can do a kind of a Britain versus America themes for the challenges. Like in the first episode when it's Chris Evans competing against Matt LeBlanc, and there's one where they use World War II Jeeps, and Chris Evans has a Mark I Landy, and Matt LeBlanc has an American military Jeep from similar World War II period. So it's like British drivers in British cars versus American drivers in American cars, and it adds that extra dynamic, which I think is quite interesting.
Getting Matt LeBlanc was obviously a bit of a coup, because I hear the show is doing all right internationally, which I guess mostly means America when you're talking about markets for English-speaking shows. So, yeah, getting someone who's like not just a minor the sort of American celebrity you get on Celebrity Big Brother, but a genuine household name in the States. It is pretty good. I was properly impressed when I heard about that. Yeah,
and he's good. I think he's good. He wears his leather jacket. He makes sort of dry, witty comments. He looks pretty cool in the shades and leather jacket and in the supercars and the sort of dune buggies they drive around. Matt LeBlanc certainly brings that kind of American star nature to the show.
Yeah, I don't know if it's just because, as I say, I felt that what the show really missed was a statement of this is what we're doing now, rather than here's to an extent a kind of rehash of the last version. And Matt LeBlanc and his sort of slightly different energy, rather than this sort of British blokiness, is probably the main big difference. And as a result, he always seems like the most obviously impressive part a lot of the time. I'm not sure doing the sort of links to camera in the studio is really playing to his strengths, but that's probably why Chris Evans does most of those.
Well, he's a TV presenter, so that's in his skill set. Matt LeBlanc is a sort of comedian, and also he's got charisma. He's got charisma coming out of his ear holes. He's just really watchable and really entertaining.
Yeah, I was trying to pick a favourite segment, and I don't know, I think it's somewhere between the South Africa one for episode 2 and Matt LeBlanc's Nomad Challenge episode 1, which I just thought was quite fun.
That was my favourite bit, when he had to escape from the paparazzi in a sort of dune buggy type thing.
Yeah, it was sort of the equivalent of him twatting around, except instead of the silliness, it was just the ridiculousness. And yeah, I thought that was good. That was a bit of a new energy. It didn't really feel like something they would have done on the old one, or at the very least it felt like it would have had a very different vibe if they'd done it on the old one. Jesse Eisenberg's sort of self-deprecating interview in episode 1 was quite good.
Yeah, that was funny. I get the sense from this that they've taken this opportunity now. They've got a brand new lineup. They're repackaging the show to make it appeal to America more, especially as they try to launch an actual Top Gear America that I think bombed quite badly. And I think their idea is that, well, this is a major BBC property. We need to sell it to Americans as well. We have a big American star as a presenter, and our first episode we're going to get on another big American star, Jesse Eisenberg, as the guest. We have Gordon Ramsay, who's well known in America as well. I think I can really see, and also they're adding this Britain versus America nature to the challenges. I think they're definitely trying to repackage it as something to be popular in the States.
Yeah, and Damien Lewis as well, obviously, who they all know from like Homeland and stuff. Yeah, I think the weakest part is when it tries to be the old thing. I mean, I think there's been a lot of criticism about the chemistry not being there anymore, as if it's somehow a devastating observation that a group of people, like 2 or 3 people who have clearly like just met, don't have the same chemistry as 3 guys who've been working together for years. Which, yeah. I don't know, I think it's not by itself an amazing story that a show where the main selling point was the presenter chemistry maybe doesn't feel quite the same when you lose the presenters and bring in someone new.
I think it'll take a while for them to hit their new stride. I mean, Top Gear has a is a British institution, has a very dedicated following, and also the kind of Clarkson, Hammond and May people really were integral to Top Gear and were very popular. So, whatever, it was going to be an uphill struggle to get this new presenter lineup to work. So that's why I can see where they've kept as much of the format as possible to reassure the fans that, as much as possible, this is the same show as before. After a while, I think they'll probably, over time, make it more of their own. I think they need to start doing the show very much like it was before, and over time it will become its own thing.
I think that was a mistake. I think making it roughly the same, as I say, sometimes almost shot for shot, as it used to be, just invites side-by-side comparisons, which, because the presenter chemistry isn't there yet, doesn't necessarily always do them any favours. But because the presenter chemistry is what people always talk about when they say Top Gear, what's that about? I mean, there's, as you say, a lot of people who didn't care about cars, or certainly people who didn't care about cars in a very serious enthusiast way, were watching it mostly for the twatting around. And yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think hopefully they'll settle into it a bit, and then they'll slowly make the show their own. I think part of me wonders if it's a very good environment for them to develop a relaxed, matey chemistry, considering the ridiculous pressure cooker tension on the whole thing, with constant news stories whenever anything goes slightly wrong during the filming, and the array of yelling reviews slamming them for not having chemistry yet, as if it isn't obvious to anyone that the odds of them getting that chemistry instantly was pretty low. I mean, I guess they could have auditioned presenters in groups and not hired someone until they found a group of existing people with an existing dynamic. To be honest, that's probably the only way they could have, like for like, replaced the Top Gear team, but evidently they haven't done that. I don't know if that was really possible to find a group of 2 or 3 people who are sufficiently interested in cars and have a similar enough dynamic. I don't know whether that would have come under the audition requirements were too specific, Bob. Can't you just say, we want a person?
I think that's why they've gone with these really established names. I mean, people like, obviously, Matt LeBlanc and Chris Evans, people with long TV careers, very established in their own right. They're used to working under pressure, and they're used to working with big legacies. I mean, it must be difficult for Matt LeBlanc. Whatever you do, you're going to be compared to Joey and how incredibly successful Friends was. I mean, he's used to coming up against big expectations, and I think it's a very good move for him to move into presenting and doing something that plays to his strengths, his comedy, his charisma. That isn't just basically doing another sitcom, because whatever sitcom he does, it will be compared inevitably Friends. And Chris Evans has had a lot of successful TV shows. Now, he's used to, again, the pressure. He's used to, high expectations for his work, even if it wasn't on a show that was already established. So I think they've chosen people who at least are used to working with, with sort of pressure and high expectations. Whether they'll gel into a cohesive format that, delivers some really great episodes, I guess that remains to be seen.
So, since we've both more or less admitted that we don't watch Top Gear regularly, or at least we haven't in the recent past, do you think you'll be keeping up with this voluntarily when I'm not forcing you to for the podcast?
I think I might check in every now and then, see how it's going. It's nice to watch a show that isn't arc-based, because it's entertainment,
it's
not
nice
fiction.
Doing
so you can just
Monster of the Week episodes on Top Gear, Monster Truck of the Week, whatever.
When it gets to the point that Top Gear has got arc plot, you know that it's the final triumph of Netflix and these sort of big TV spectacles. But it's nice to have a show that you can drop in and out of. So I'll certainly drop in and out, and it's a good show that's light and entertaining and funny and not that taxing. I mean, generally, I'm not particularly into cars, and the kind of the laddish humour of Top Gear is not my go-to humour. I'm more of a sort of satire, or sort of Stuart Lee is more my kind of humour.
Maybe that's why we're being less knife to the face hard on it than a lot of people. For a lot of people, taking away from the laddish humour towards something that's a bit more sort of sarcastic media type, maybe, has moved it more into our wheelhouse, whereas it has arguably probably moved it out of the wheelhouse of a lot of the old fans.
That's a possibility. But I did find myself just sort of grinning and laughing, along to the kind of the silly scrapes they get themselves in, and the ridiculous, the ridiculous feats, like in the South Africa episode when they had to drive up a hill with a giant cocktail without spilling any, and it's just silly. And then Matt LeBlanc, this is just a bit when he bursts out laughing and goes like, "My balls are wet." It's kind of. It's Top Gear at its core. It's laddish, it's silly, blokes messing around in cars, having a good time, and it is just funny and entertaining. It's got a certain magic to it. That's why it's been going for this long. And I hope that they can find a way to make it, for that Chris Evans and Matt LeBlanc can find a way to make it their own thing. Because, and I don't want to dwell too much on this, but, Clarkson, Hammond and May did have quite a unpleasant exit from the show, Clarkson especially. And I think with, Chris Evans and Matt LeBlanc, they wanted people who could bring that kind of laddish, fun nature to Top Gear. That probably won't be as controversial as the previous presenters. I mean, there was a whole string of, almost diplomatic scandals caused by various comments people made in the show, especially about other countries. And
well, exactly, they're the sort of more media savvy, came up in the modern media climate type people who probably do know not to make racially sensitive comments when the cameras are rolling.
Yeah, the thing is, some of the people I think really like Top Gear because of especially Clarkson's kind of un-PC personality, that they feel this is the last place on TV where, you sort of men can be sort of men, which is, considering almost all of TV is a lot of men being men, is incredibly narrow-minded.
Well, I mean, the current format of Top Gear kind of evolved around the Clarkson-Hammond-May trio as well, because before, I gather, I didn't watch it because I was youngish and really didn't care about cars. Before that, it was a fairly dry car journalism show. So that's another way in which it is kind of viewed as their format, and more new people coming in are always going to have a bit of a wearing-in process.
Yeah, I mean, Clarkson and Hammond made, like I say, made Top Gear the institution it is. I mean, if you ever get a chance to see, like, the original series of Top Gear, they do just drive around in family hatchbacks and compare, which one has the best parking.
Sounds amazing.
It's hilariously dull.
Yeah, and then they went to Channel 5, didn't they? But yeah, I mean, part of me occasionally finds the sort of anger that they're still making Top Gear without Clarkson, Hammond and May a bit weird, considering Clarkson, Hammond and May have a new show coming up, which we may well cover. It probably depends what else is on that fortnight. And yeah, I mean, it's not as if you're not getting your thing. I mean, I suppose now there's a chance you might have to pay for Amazon Prime to get your thing. But I mean, I get the feeling Clarkson, Hammond and May have kind of outgrown the Top Gear format anyway. It sounds a lot like their new show. It's just going to be where they could focus on the twatting around and completely ditched that boring part of the show where they had to actually pretend to do serious car journalism.
Yeah, and I think that Chris Evans and Matt LeBlanc seem generally enthusiastic about the show. I think they really want to give it a good go and really make this work. They're not just there for the money. There must be a reason. I mean, Matt LeBlanc certainly, has probably got a lot of very lucrative offers coming in, and there must be something that had particularly attracted him to this, and it must be a desire to want to create something that's
I think I didn't know that he was a bit of a car guy, like before I heard he was on Top Gear, so yeah, it is quite possible this genuinely speaks to his passions.
Yeah, I think generally the prerequisite for being a Top Gear presenter is, obviously being a massive petrol head.
But yeah, no, I'm sure I'll watch it again. It usually gets put on at my parents' house when I'm home for whatever reason, because it's, funnily enough, uncontroversial fun for all the family. It's something we'll all at least enjoy on some level. Okay, and lastly this fortnight, for our recommendations feature, still unnamed. I recommended Alastair, Black Panther The Client by Christopher Priest and Mark Texeira, which is a comic from the late 90s, like the very late last year or two of the 90s, which brought the Black Panther back into circulation after an extended period just appearing in the occasional Avengers comic. And yeah, it reinvented the Black Panther to an extent as this uber-competent political operator and changed the tone of the comic to be more a sort of wryly, cynically comic political thriller. It's one of my favourite comics of all time, I think. Certainly one of my favourite Marvel superhero comics. Big fan of Christopher Priest's style in both this and other stuff like Quantum and Woody. So yeah, as I say, one of my favourite things. Hopefully Alastair likes it as well. Do you?
Yeah, it was a great story.
Yes.
And it was certainly really good to find out more about the Black Panther, following on from enjoying seeing the character in Captain America Civil War.
Yeah, I think there's a fair bit of difference between the two characters. Obviously, this is as I say, the uber competence of the Black Panther is something that's developed over the course of his career. He's been the Black Panther for a while. He's been king for quite a while. Yeah,
it was a really interesting story. It does play around with narrative a lot. It is sort of unconventionally non-linear.
Christopher Priest is very into that, yeah.
Yeah, which is, and again, it starts with like the story in the middle, and which is one of the points with the highest tension, and that's good just to throw you in. At first, I did find it, a bit difficult to follow, going back and forth in time, but it's kind of structured around the character Everett K. Ross explaining to his boss kind of what happened. So he kind of fills it in a sort of disjointed, non-linear way, but she's there to keep the story on track, keep bringing him back to kind of the main points. And the other thing that also really worked about it was that this story has the Black Panther as this sort of uber-competent, uber-powerful, sort of figure. It was a good choice to not make him the protagonist, because you don't want the protagonist of your story to be too competent, or else there isn't a sense of tension and they're not relatable. So by making the audience sees the character, through the eyes of a regular person who's kind of their window into the story, it's seen through the eyes of Everett K. Ross, who works for the Officer Protocol, and he's a relatable character, and you experience the story from his point of view.
What Priest wants, I think, as someone who's bringing back the Black Panther after a long period where he'd basically just been the token non-white person standing at the back of the Avengers, is to, really nail home, this is why this character is awesome. And I think he'd been watching Friends at the time. I've read a few essays on Priest's website about this, where he watched Friends and saw the character of Chandler, and he was like, yes, that guy. I want to put that guy in there so he can both react to the Black Panther and be entertaining in his own right.
Yeah, and that works really well.
I mean, I know there are hardcore Black Panther fans who find the focus on Everett K. Ross as the protagonist reacting to the Black Panther rather than the Black Panther himself being the point of view hero a bit not their cup of tea. And as someone who came to this more as a Christopher Priest fan than a Black Panther fan, obviously I have different priorities to them. I like Priest's style and I'm fine with it, but I can see how if you just want to really, get under the skin of the Black Panther, it might be a bit frustrating.
Yeah, the Black Panther being so powerful and also somewhat of an enigma, it makes it difficult for him to be a protagonist. I mean, I can see why people may object is that the Black Panther is one of the few sort of black and powerful sort of superhero characters, and to make him a secondary character in his own story in favour of a white protagonist, I guess is certainly could be viewed as problematic. But from a narrative point of view, there is an element of, if you have uber competent superheroes, especially uber competent, uber aware superheroes, don't make for great main characters.
Well, the vision of the Black Panther as this sort of uber competent two steps ahead operator is also kind of a Priest creation, to be honest. I think earlier stories focused a bit more on him as this relatable guy who came to the throne quite young and was just getting used to it. I mean, there is talk here about him being ultimately a very optimistic, altruistic man, even though he's also quite taciturn.
Yeah, he goes back to his childhood, and that was interesting, filling in his childhood and kind of his background and how he got to the position he is. And also it's interesting to have all that done in a non-linear point of view, because this comic would have been quite boring if it started, the Black Panther was born on this day, and on this day he came to the throne, and yada yada, and all this stuff happened before the story, and all these things happened before we really get to the story. And it's kind of like, no, just start with the story, go right into the middle of it, and then fill in information as we need it, when we need it.
We'll go to the middle of it, then go to sort of the middle of the beginning, then the end of the beginning, then the middle again, then the beginning. Yeah.
Comics really work well in a non-linear format, I think, because a comic is structured around a series of individual cells containing fragments of story. Sometimes these cells can be combined in interesting ways, but for each cell, there has to become a point when that cell finishes and the next one begins. Therefore, there's always a transition, which means it's easier to rearrange the order. You expect cells to flow from one to the other in a linear sort of format, but you can move them around. But because each one is disconnected, the jump seems more fluid. Where with film, you have a progression of events that you then have to interrupt to move to a different progression of events, which jars a bit more if you're going to jump around in time.
Yeah, there's a bit, but a bit I really liked, which when I was rereading it the other day, where Everett K. Ross is recounting the events to his boss, Nikki, boss and also girlfriend, and she says, no, they start at the beginning, and then there's a flash of a bit of the story, and then she goes, at the beginning, Ross, and then there's another flash, and then he just keeps doing panels from slightly earlier in the story until she throws a drink over him, and he actually goes back to the beginning.
Yeah, that worked really well.
Which I thought was quite a fun way of just sort of putting these one-panel flashes in, just to make it clear that this is a visually distinct part of the story, even if still not the beginning.
Even though it's not the beginning of the Panther's story, and it's not the first time he was written, but it is accessible to people who haven't read Black Panther stories before, because even though it's written in a non-linear way, it's quite disjointed. It drops you right into the middle. Even though it's a complex story that, as someone who watches a lot of art house films, I'm used to complex and disjointed narratives, not in non-linear storytelling. So from that point of view, it wasn't accessible, but as someone, I found that accessible. But in terms of a character point of view, it was very accessible, which was great. It filled in all that you need to know about the character. It didn't include anything you really didn't need to know about the character, and it told the story. And the story also completely filled in who the Black Panther was. I mean, to contrast that to DC Rebirth, which has a fairly non-linear story, but not quite as disjointed as the client does. But in that sense, that there were constant references to things outside the frame which you didn't know about, which made the story less accessible, even though it was a much more straightforwardly structured story. It was, because you didn't know the characters, it made it a more difficult story to follow. Black Panther, the client, is a much more complex story in terms of plot and in terms of structure, but is more accessible in terms of character, and that's one of the reasons why I liked it a lot more.
I think he's talking to two different audiences in terms of accessibility. There's the people who don't know who the Black Panther is, and he's trying to, go, this is who he is and this is why he's cool. And there's also the people who, for lack of a better term, think the Black Panther is a bit lame. He's a sort of the stuffy king character who, as I say, stands in the back of Avengers group shots and talks in an overly formal, legal way. And so he's both making the case for this is who he is for complete newcomers, and this is why he's cool and you shouldn't think he's boring. And, he uses Everett K. Ross quite transparently to do that, as someone who both isn't that familiar with the Black Panther and someone who does kind of know him and thinks he's a bit lame.
Yeah, and that works really well.
So he's an audience surrogate in a really plain way, but it does what Priest wants it to do, I think.
I also really liked how the story played around with genre. It starts out as a more of a sort of conventional crime story, which is the Black Panther has arrived in New York to solve a murder, and then it kind of evolves that into a sort of political thriller as there's destabilization in his home country, and then it finally moves into a more fantastical story as, the destabilization is revealed to be partly the result of a demon interfering in our reality.
And the Devil's Pants, one of my favourite comic beats of any comic.
And Everett K. Ross loses his pants and then gets given some pants by the devil.
Obviously we mean trousers. We're American pants.
Yeah, American pants. And then in one scene he's just like sort of drowning in enormous numbers of trousers that just keep sort of multiplying endlessly.
Yeah, there's numerous scenes where he and the devil are just sitting in his flat.
Making awkward small talk.
Yeah, but Priest's sort of sense of humour is great, and I read this when I was, quite young, sort of easily influenceable teenager. So it's a big influence on, to be honest, things I write myself, I think. I'm a big fan of this sort of thing.
It's got a wiry sense of humour. And for a complex story and for what is quite a dark story and quite a dense story, those moments of humour really do help. It's the sort of thing that, yes, this is a complex story and we've got a character that we're, sort of treating seriously, but, it's not all, this isn't all James Joyce and kind of everyone taking themselves really seriously. There's some humour in it. There's some lighter moments, which help.
Mostly Everett K. Ross, and the way Everett K. Ross bounces off some of the more serious, dead serious members of the Panther's entourage, like his big mentor friend Zuri and the Dora Milaje, his sort of, again, deadly serious bodyguards. There's a serious-looking woman bodyguard in Captain America Civil War towards the end, who's working for the Panther, who I think is meant to be one of the Dora Milaje, but we'll find out when his film comes out.
That's what I assumed as well. But I thought Everett K. Ross was a really great Dr. Watson character. The way that, because, in the Sherlock Holmes novels, they're told from Dr. Watson's point of view because the workings of Sherlock's mind are sort of unknowable to most humans. So it needs Dr. Watson to be a regular person to ask questions and get sort of Sherlock Holmes to explain the character Sherlock Holmes.
Also, if you're saying Everett K. Ross is a Dr. Watson character, it's quite funny that he's played by Martin Freeman.
Yeah, that's a nice bit of symmetry there.
Yeah, I don't actually know if Martin Freeman is going to be popping up in the Black Panther film. It would seem ridiculous to have cast him and then not use him at this stage. But maybe he's just going to be a general Agent Coulson style Marvel Universe government stooge. I don't know.
Yeah.
They haven't even started filming it yet. I'm sure that information will emerge over the next year or so. Yeah. Massive fan of this. I also really like the art. I think painted art in comics can sometimes look a bit stiff and a bit sort of like it's been drawn from static models, because in some cases I suspect it has. But yeah, I thought this was really, really good and really dynamic and told the story quite nicely.
Yeah, it was beautiful. That's one thing I really wanted to say. It was very beautifully done. And there was it was done vaguely sort of abstract way. It wasn't done with a kind of, it's interesting you said that it was actually painted rather than drawn, because, now that you said that, I can completely see that in the art. It wasn't done in this very, realistic way. I mean, realism is a school within painting, and it wasn't done in that style. And as someone who really likes, say, the paintings of, the Impressionists and the Post-Impressionists, I felt it really worked in that way, in the sense that, there weren't so much definite edges to people, and even though the colours were generally darker than, say, Impressionist painters would use, there was, the way the kind of backgrounds and characters sort of blurred together and kind of shadows were indistinct and, sort of form was slightly indefinite. I thought that's really beautiful, really well done, real attention to detail. And it also works in a kind of story that deals with fantasy characters, that deals with iconic characters, like the Black Panther, that are somewhat unknowable, having them have an indefinite edge. I know it gives it that kind of otherworldly sense that these kind of greater-than-life characters should have.
Yeah, and I think thinking in the demon creature plays nicely for your sort of slightly abstract painting style, because, hell and demons and piles of skulls. Why not?
It's better implied. It's better if it appears in a kind of vague form that implies everything about hell rather than trying to accurately illustrate what hell looks like.
Yeah, but I thought, surprisingly, considering that Priest is clearly going for a very grounded, real-world political thriller feeling, that Mark Texeira's sort of painted art really balanced it well. I thought it was a really lovely package. Big fan.
The two contrast each other very well.
Yeah, and obviously this is the first 5 issues of an ongoing series that ended up running for over 60. So there's a lot of giving stuff a kick to get it in motion and then throwing it to the next issues. But, unlike DC Rebirth, you know exactly where the story continues in Black Panther number 6.
Yeah, and it was those 5 issues do form a self-contained story that you felt you can read, and you get to the end, and although there is a throw to sequel, you do sense, well, I've experienced the story and it's reached its conclusion, and I'm happy with where it ends.
Yeah, but yes, no, I'm glad you enjoyed this. I think the podcast can continue, so that's nice for everybody.
One small note of criticism, slightly unfortunate use of African stereotypes. So I like the fact that Wakanda is shown as being the most technologically advanced nation in Africa, possibly the most technologically advanced nation in the world. And there's lots of things like some countries in Africa that are, in the GDP terms, poorer than our countries, say, have much better broadband, much better tech centres, because they've sort of built them to compete. But this comic does throw in a few African stereotypes, such as Wakanda obviously has internal tribal struggles between different tribes. There's the whole thing also to do with like large numbers of refugees. Dispossession and internal ethnic struggle in African countries is a stereotype which it'd be great if people portraying Africa could really get away from.
Yeah, but obviously this comic is depressingly coming up to 20 years old.
I didn't realise it was quite that old. 20 years ago, that was more of a thing than it is now.
At this point, it's 18 years old? So yeah, and obviously Priest is working within the previously defined Wakanda, which in old Marvel comics, of course, are not well known for being progressive. There's a new Black Panther series which started like a couple of months back by the writer and commentator Ta-Nehisi Coates and art by Brian Stelfreeze, which has been getting praise for delivering a more modern-day, nuanced vision of Wakanda, so hopefully that's good.
Yeah, that does sound like good. And I think it's just important to be aware of, because the way we understand a place is through our popular culture and its representations in popular culture. And one thing I try to be aware of is when stereotypes about Africa are perpetuating our assumptions about Africa. But yeah, like I say, this was definitely something that was more prevalent in the past, and it was definitely politically more of a reality sort of 18 years ago. But it wasn't a major feature of the comic. It was merely a background thing. It didn't affect my enjoyment of it at all. I just think it just needs to be... I'd like to bring these up when it comes up because it is an important note, and you'll find very well-respected TV shows and books falling into these problems of African stereotypes. So for next episode, we'll be watching what could be one of my favourite films, which is Richard Linklater's A Scanner Darkly, based on the novel by Philip K. Dick.
Oh, the one with Keanu Reeves.
Yes, Keanu Reeves. It stars Robbie Downey Jr. in one of his first roles, I think, after he got back from rehab. This is pre-Iron Man, Robbie Downey Jr.
Okay.
The Picture House cinema chain in London is having a Richard Linklater season, so we'll be seeing this in the cinema.
Okay, cool. I should probably get the time of that off you, but we'll save that for when we finish recording.
It's a great dystopian future story in which pretty much everything every human does is constantly surveyed, and also a new drug called death is sweeping across America, and to take death is to die quite quickly.
Seems fair. But yeah, okay, cool. I look forward to seeing that in a few days. So I believe that brings us to the end of our Moderate Fantasy Violence for this week. Fortnight, take a drink. So yeah, thanks for listening. If you want more Moderate Fantasy Violence based content, you can go to moderatefantasyviolence.com, where you can get all our old episodes, a few written essays, including Alastair's review of Kill Command and my piece on Flash and Arrow's use of canon in love interests, and there's a deleted scene from the last episode where we talk a bit more about X-Men franchises stuff. So yeah, that's good. We're also on Twitter as @MFV Podcast.
You can also follow us on Facebook, where we have a like page, and you can follow us on Tumblr, where we are also Moderate Fantasy Violence. I've been Alastair Ball. You can find my writing on politics at redtrainblog.blogspot.com. You can follow my writing about science fiction at nimberspace.co.uk, and you can follow me on Twitter at Alastair J.R. Ball.
Yep, and I've been Nick Bryan. You can follow me on Twitter as @NickMB, or you can go to nickbryan.com for more about my self-published crime books and other pop culture-based writing, maybe sometimes. Okay, thank you very much. We'll be back in the usual couple of weeks with probably Outcast, the new TV show from the creator of The Walking Dead, and the first few episodes of Orange is the New Black, plus Scanner Darkly, of course. Alright, see you then. Bye.
Bye.
There were alleged casting notes leaked onto the internet, which suggest they are actually casting Zuri and Achebe as well. So
great.
That's going to be interesting.
Mr. T could play one of the roles? Probably not.
I didn't even realise he was still alive.
I think maybe we should do that now. Or just use that for the end.